ለመማር ወደ ትምህርት ተቋም መሄድ ግድ አይደለም። ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ
ራሳችሁን ከኮሮና ቫይረስ ወረርሽኝ እየጠበቃችሁ በቤታችሁ ወይም በተመቻችሁ ቦታ በኢንተርኔት አማካኝነት በኦንላይን ትምህርታችሁን መከታተል ትችላላችሁ።
ካናዳ ከሚገኘው ኢንተርናሽናል ኤር ትራንስፖርት አሶሲዬሽን አያታና ከእንግሊዙ ኢንስቲትዩት ኦፍ ኮመርሻል ማኔጅመንት ICM ጋር በመተባበር የሚሰጡ ትምህርቶችን ተከታትላችሁ በ6 ወር ጊዜ በዓለም አቀፍ ደረጃ ተቀባይነት ያለውን የስልጠና ማስረጃ ባለቤት መሆን ይቻላል።
ልምድ ባላቸው መምህራን እየተማራችሁ ጥያቄና መልስ የክፍል ስራዎች ፈተና መፈተን ክፍል ውስጥ እንዳላችሁት አይነት በኦንላይን ባላችሁበት ቦታ ከናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ
የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ
Good afternoon, students. Please inbox me if my audio is not audible for you. Don't remain silent if my voice is not audible for all of you. So now we can start today's session. As you remember, in our last session, we have seen the first 3 lessons of chapter 2. The first one is basic preliminary concepts of logic, such as premise, conclusion, and argument. In the second lesson, we have seen the non-argumentative passages, identifying or recognizing non-argumentative passages from argumentative passage. And in the last session, the third lesson is all about the types of argument. Under this session, we have seen the 2 different types of argument, the deductive and the inductive types of argument. Under this, we have said that a deductive argument is a type of argument in which there is a kind of relationship between the premises and the conclusion in such a way that the premises provide or gives a necessary condition for the conclusion. So the arguer can certainly or absolutely argue about the conclusion based on the evidence that you have in the premises. And you have said in inductive argument, there is only probability, no certainty, so that the relation between the premises and the conclusion is depends on probability, not on certainty, which it can be or it may not be. So it's based on probabilistic reasoning process. Besides this, we have seen some examples of this for both types of argument. We have also seen the 3 basic factors that help us or influence us for distinguish the 2 types of argument. Please, students, make the video on, please. If you do not do this, I'm obliged to reject your attendance from this meeting. I have told you many times. Okay, thank you. Now I can easily observe and control you guys. So we have seen the 3 factors that help us for identifying the typologies of the argument. The first is an indicator of special words. That is, if there are words like certainly, absolutely, necessarily, we can speculate that that type of argument is deductive, and on the other hand, if there are words such as likely, unlikely, plausibly, implausibly, we can understand that typologies of argument is an inductive, so the occurrence of special words can give us a clue for identifying the typologies of the argument. But the existence of special indicator words are not help us merely for differentiating the types of arguments. So we need to look at in conjugation with the other factors of the that help us for identifying the typologies of the argument. The second is the link, the strings of the link between the premises and the conclusion. We have said if there is a kind of link which is necessarily based, that's a kind of deductive. On the other hand, if there is a kind of linkage between the premises and the conclusion, which is depend on probability, that is a kind of inductive argument. The other factors that we have discussed so far is that the character or the forms of the argument that the arguer uses. We have been the three instances or examples of the forms of deductive arguments, such as if an argument is formed or constructed by applying mathematical rules, such as geometry, algebra, and mathematical operations, is typical an examples of deductive argument. But we have seen an exception in sampling statistics. The second instance of deductive, we have seen the argument based on definition and sinologism. We have seen the three categories of sinologism: the hypothetical, the disjunctive, and also we have seen the categorical, the three, and also we have seen the instance of inductive argument. If an argument is constructed on prediction, on analogy, on inductive generalization, and arguments from authority based on sign and causal inference, typically there are examples of inductive argument. But there are also other considerations that we need to look at. For example, when we go back to the time of, or we extend back to the time of Aristotle, holds that a deductive argument at that time was understood as it's a decreasing, which means a types of argument that flows from general to specific, it's decreasing. And also inductive argument understood as an argument that is from specific to general. It was applied basically during the Aristotelian time, and also there are other considerations. There are also other considerations, so that you need to refer other relevant materials on this. I personally recommend you to read the precise introduction to precise logic on this issue if you are if you wanted to broaden your understanding of the instance of the inductive arguments. So today, our today's session is that the fourth method is that evaluating arguments. And as the introductory parts of chapter 2, I have said that in the case of deductive argument, in deductive argument, the evaluation is all about its validity and its soundness. Whereas while evaluating inductive argument, we use the terminology such as its strength and its cogency, or its weakness and its uncogency. So in evaluating deductive argument, we'll look at the validity, truth, and soundness. These are the three basic concepts that are very pivotal for your understanding of evaluating argument in the case of deductive argument. So now let's see what valid deductive argument is. I think you have a better understanding of what deductive argument is. Valid deductive argument is a type of, it is one form of deductive argument such that if the premises are assumed true and if it is impossible for the conclusion to be false, we call it this as valid deductive argument. In such argument, which means in the case of valid deductive argument, the conclusion follows with a strict necessity from the premises. So that here you can understand the reasoning process or the inference within the argument from the premise to the conclusion flows in a necessity or in a strict necessity, which means if we assume or if we support that we have a true premises, in the case of valid deductive argument, it is impossible for the conclusion to be false. So we are certain the conclusion also true. On the other hand, or on the contrary, conversely, in the case of invalid inductive argument, which is the direct opposite of the valid deductive argument, the opposite term, opposite must be understood in a contextualized manner, is an argument that if the premises are assumed true, it's possible for the conclusion to be false. So in the case of invalid deductive argument, we have the possibility for the conclusion to be false, even though we have a true premises. We see how the reasoning process flows from the premises to the conclusion. In the first case, there is a strict flow of evidence from the premises to the conclusion. Whereas in the case of invalid deductive argument, it is possible for the conclusion to be false, even though we have a true premises. So in the case of invalid argument, the conclusion does not flow with a strict necessity from the premise, but it's claimed to be. It's claimed to follow from the premises. It's claimed to, but it may not be. Let us look at examples of valid, was valid, and invalid deductive arguments. Let's look at the first example here, example 1, valid deductive argument. As you can see from the screen, the first example says that all men are mammals. This is the first premises, premises 1. And all bulls are men. This is the second premises. From these two premises, we have the conclusion, all bulls are mammals. As you can understand from this example, if we assume that the first and the second premises are true, all men are mammals if this premises is true, and if the second premises all bulls are men is true, from this given two premises, an arguer can certainly deduct that all bulls are mammals, because he can able to certainly or necessarily argue that all bulls are mammals. Because if all men are mammals, that's the first premises, and if all bulls are men, necessarily or strictly all bulls are mammals. There is a transitivity here, a rule of transferability. If we say that a man A, and if we say that a mammal B, which means all A are all B, and if we say that bull C, all C are B, here there is transferability of bulls and men, means there is transferability of men and bulls. There is transferability rule here. So this is a typical examples of valid deductive argument. We have true premises, and it's impossible for the bull not to be a mammal. By any means, it's impossible for the bull not to be a mammal. He has only the chance to be a mammal because we have the first two necessary evidences. So this example is valid argument because the conclusion actually followed from the premises. If all men, as I have told you, if all men are assumed as mammals and bulls are men, then it's impossible for the bull not to be a mammal. Therefore, this argument is a valid deductive argument. You understand? Okay. The second example, let's look at the examples of invalid deductive argument. Look here, if we say that the first premise is all philosophers are rational, you see? And if we have the second premise is Socrates was rational, from these two premises, an arguer concludes that Socrates was a philosopher. This example differs a little bit from the first valid deductive argument because there is no transferability here. Look, the first one. All philosophers are rational. And Socrates was irrational. Socrates was probably a philosopher. If you want to look at what makes this argument invalid deductive argument is that if you assume the first two premises as true, that all philosophers are rational, if we assume this premise true, and if you assume Socrates was rational as true, we are not in a position to say that Socrates was a philosopher. No, at all. Because in order for the Socrates to be rational, first he must be a philosopher. Socrates, here it must be written like Socrates, if we say that Socrates was a philosopher, we can conclude that Socrates was a philosopher, okay? It must be, the second premises, this must be changed into that Socrates was a philosopher. With the given examples, an arguer can say that Socrates can probably be a philosopher. At the same time, he may not be. Because first, he must be a philosopher in order to become a rational. The transferability works like this. So the example is invalid because there is the link between these first two premises and the conclusions is not actually from a strict necessity. As I have told you, he may be a philosopher at the same time, he may not be. Because there are individuals who are rational, but they may not be philosophers. They may be rational, but they may not be. If they are philosopher, we can say that we can speak of necessarily Socrates was rational. So it does not actually from the premise with a strict necessity, but it claimed to. It tries to be as valid, but there is here, though it's a deductive argument, we cannot speak of here about certainty. That's even if we assume that all philosophers are rational and Socrates is rational, it is not impossible for Socrates not to be a philosopher, okay? This is the examples of inductive, invalid deductive argument. So from the above two examples and from the above understanding or from the above definitions, valid and invalid arguments led us to immediate conclusions. The first one that we understand from the first two examples is that there is no middle ground. There is no middle ground between valid and invalid. A certain argument is either valid or either invalid. Either of the two. It cannot rely on the middle ground. So that we should label an argument either invalid or valid. We should not say it at the middle ground. That is why we're saying the second example is invalid, even though it is a deductive. The second lesson that you can learn from the above examples and definitions is that there is only indirect relation between validity and truth. This is the key expression you need to understand. There is only a indirect relation between validity and truth, okay? For an argument to be valid is not necessarily that either the premise or the conclusion to be true, but merely that if the premise assumed true, it's impossible for the conclusion to be false. We can argue by considering the given premises as an assumption, by assuming they are true. So the most important thing that you can note here is that is not the truth and the falsity of the premises. What's most matter in determining the validity and the invalidity of the deductiveness of the argument. It is the relationship between the factual and the inferential claim. You can argue by assuming as that the premises is true. This is the two basic things that you can understand from the first two examples. That is, we do not have to know whether the premises of an argument is actually true, or in order to determine its validity. The validity can be valid and invalid. So you are not supposed to actually determine its value. You can argue by taking that by assumptions under consideration. If you can argue if the first two premises are true, can say like this. Therefore, to test an argument for validity, begin by assuming that all premises are true, then are true, and we determine if it is possible in line of that assumption for the conclusion to be false. I have already told you this one. Therefore, the validity of the argument is the connection between the premises and the conclusion, rather than on the actual truth or falsity of the statement formed on the argument. We look at examples. How much looking at the link or the connection of the premises and the conclusion can help us for determining the validity of the argument. We have only one exception, that the truthness and the falsity of the premises and the conclusion can affect us in determining its validity and invalidity. That is when we have a true premises and false conclusion. It's the exception that works. In general, in evaluating arguments, we have four possibilities with respect to the truthfulness and the falsity of the premises and the conclusion of the given argument. The first possibility that we may have is that we may have true premises and true conclusion. The first possibility, true premises and true conclusion. And the second possibility is that we may have true premises but false conclusion. This is the exceptions. Is always invalid. Only by mere observation of the truthfulness of the premises and the conclusion, an observer can determine its validity. It's always invalid. That is the point that truthness and falsity can help us in determining their validity. On the other possibilities, the most important thing in determining the validity is the relationship between the factual claim and the inferential claim. That is the premises and the conclusion, or the reasoning process matters or affects the validity of the argument. The third possibility is that we may have false premises and true conclusion. The fourth possibility is that we may have again false premises but false conclusion. These are the four possibilities with respect to the truth and falsity of the premises and the conclusion in a given argument. Having this bear in mind, Let's look at the next issues which are related with these possibilities. As I have told you, all of the upper possibilities, these possibilities, except the second cases that I have told you, the second case, that is in case of true premises and false conclusion, allow for both valid and invalid, which means the above three possibilities, except the second possibilities, can allow us an arguer or a given argument to be both valid and invalid at the same time, depending on the connection between the premise and the conclusion. But the second case, that is when we have true premise and false conclusion, does not allow for valid argument, which means always the second case is invalid argument. When we put the possibilities in a table, we have here's the premise, is a conclusion, and its validity. Depending on the relation between these premises and this conclusion, we determine the validity of the deductive argument. For example, let's look at the first. We have true premises, and also here we have true conclusion. In this case, the validity can be either valid or invalid, depending on the evidences or the claims that the arguer has in his premises. We'll look at examples here in your module. The second, as I have told you, it is true when we have true premises and false conclusion. The validity of this deductive argument is always invalid. It cannot be valid by any means. By any means. It's always invalid. Don't forget this exception. It's always invalid. It cannot be valid. The third possibility is that we may have false premises and true conclusion. At the same time, we may have false premises and false conclusion. For both cases, the validity can be both valid and invalid, depending on the relation between the premise and the conclusions. We'll look at how it becomes valid and how it becomes invalid, having these possibilities. But in general, we can say that the basic idea of evaluating deductive argument, that is its validity and invalidity, is that it's not something that the actual truth value and falsity of the premises and the conclusion. Rather, what is most important thing in evaluating the deductiveness is that the relation between the premise and the conclusion, as I have told you. That is why when we have these possibilities that we say it might be valid, was valid, and invalid in the three possibilities. So the question is not whether the premise and the conclusion are true, but whether the premise support the conclusion or not. When the premises support us, here, to make it brief for you, when the premises support us, it's a conclusion, we can say that it's valid. It's valid. Please make your voice audible, Ahmed Dastar. You are disturbing me, okay? So The most important thing is that the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. Don't forget it's very preliminary concept for your understanding of logic and arguments in general. It may mislead you by only or mere observation of the truthfulness and the falsity of the premises and the conclusion. You need to look at the connection, the reasoning process, or the inference, how it flows from the premise to the conclusion. Nevertheless, there is, as I have told you, there is one exception that what the truthfulness and the falsity of the premise and the conclusion help us in identifying its validity. That is the second exception we have said, when we have true premises and false conclusion. When we have, that is, when we have true premises, that is still refers to true premises and false conclusion. This is the exception we have seen previously. So now let's see, we have seen the validity, that is the invalid and the valid deductive argument. Let me share you.
በትምህርት ከፍ ብሎ መብረር ይቻላል። ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ከከፍተኛ ትምህርት አግባብነትና ጥራት ኤጀንሲ ሙሉ ዕውቅናን ባገኘንባቸው በማስተርስ ዲግሪ ኤምቢኤ በስትራቴጂክ ማኔጅመንት፣ ኤምቢኤ በባንኪንግ እና ፋይናንስ፣ ኤምቢኤ በቢዝነስ ሊደርሺፕ፣ ኤምቢኤ በሪስክና ኢንሹራንስ፣ ኤምኤስሲ በኢንተርናሽናል ትሬድ እና ኢኮኖሚክስ ዘርፎች በእውቀት ለመቅረጽ የበቁ ፕሮፌሰሮቻችን አረንጓዴ መብራታቸውን አብርተዋል። በነገራችን ላይ በኬንያ ሀገር ከሚገኙ ስመጥር ዩኒቨርሲቲዎች በሚመጡ ፕሮፌሰሮች የትኩረት መስክ ትምህርቶቹ መሰጠታቸው ልዩ ያደርገናል። በምርጥ የትምህርት ስርዓት የተገነባው ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ በመጀመሪያ ዲግሪ በአቪዬሽን ማኔጅመንት፣ በሆቴል ማኔጅመንት፣ በአካውንቲንግ እና ፋይናንስ፣ በማርኬቲንግ ማኔጅመንት አስተማማኝ ትምህርት ይገቢውና ራስዎንና ሀገሮን ይለውጡ። አድራሻ 22 አደባባይ ወደ ሾላ በሚወስደው መንገድ ላይ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ህልሞን እውን ያደርጋል።
Let's look at examples of the above possibilities. As you can see from your module, the first possibility is that, as I have told you, when we have a true premises and a true conclusion, and I have told you that in this possibility, the argument can be both valid and invalid. As you can see here, the first example, all women are mammals. That's the first premises. And its truth value is true. And my mother is a mammal is true. And therefore, my mother is a woman. This is true conclusion. At the same time, we may have true premises, true conclusion, but it's invalid. Thus, all philosophers are critical thinkers. And the second premise is that the true premises is Plato was a critical thinker. And from these two premises, we can invalidly argue that Plato was a philosopher. The reason why, what makes this deductive argument invalid is that though we have true premises and true conclusion, look the first premises. That's all philosophers are critical thinkers, and Plato was a critical thinker. As I have told you, in order for a Plato to be a critical thinker, first he must be a philosopher. That is the rule of transferability. He must be. So that because of the absence of the second premises, that is Plato was a philosopher, the relation between the first premises and the conclusions is not on necessity. It does not flow with a strict necessity. That is why what makes these typical examples of deductive argument is invalid. because of the connection between these premises and the conclusion does not let us to strictly argue that Plato was a philosopher. Because first, Plato must be a philosopher in order to conclude that Plato must be a philosopher in order to say that Plato was a critical thinker. Do you understand? This example works even for other possibilities. Why other possibilities can be both valid and invalid? Let's look at the second examples. That is when we have true premises and false conclusion. That's the exception. We have said that in this example, it's always invalid. It's invalid. Look at this example. All biologists are scientists. The second premise is John Nash was a scientist. Therefore, John Nash was a biologist. I have told this why it become invalid. If we have two premises and false conclusion, it's always invalid. The third possibility is that when we have false premises and true conclusion. Look here, the valid deductive argument of the third possibility. All birds are mammals. It's false premises. We assume it as a false premises. Okay? We are not obliged, or you should not actually think of the truth value of these premises. You can argue by taking consideration these two premises are false, no matter their actual or factual truthfulness of the premises are. We can argue by supposing or by considering this is a false premises, no matter the factual claim of this premises is. We assume this as a false premises, and we assume all means are birds are the false premises. If we assume these false premises, we can here conclude that all means are mammals. Is it valid? Because we assume that if we have the first premise that is birds, all birds are mammals, and if all women are birds, birds is a transferability, birds, not if it's written like mammals, there is no transferability. If it's written like this one, this is the case of ostrich. So it's valid because the two premises help us to necessarily or strictly argue that all women are mammals. It's impossible for a woman not to be a mammal. We can certainly argue that all women are mammals by assuming that the premises are true. Here is the second example, that is the invalidity. So we have false premises, we may have true conclusion. The difference is that you see here all birds are mammals, and it says all ostriches are mammals. If it said that all ostriches are birds, and if we assume this a false, it may become invalid. But here there is no transferability. An ostrich must first be a bird in order to say that all ostriches are mammals. So that is why it makes invalid, which means it does not help us to strictly or necessarily argue that all ostriches are birds. The last possibility is this one. All Americans are Ethiopians, all Egyptians Americans, all Egyptians are Ethiopian. You see the transferability? All Americans are Ethiopians as false premises. We assume this as a false, and if we assume the second as all Egyptians are Americans, not Ethiopians. Not Ethiopian here. The problem is here that you understand in the case of invalidity. So from these two false premises, we can argue that all Egyptians are Ethiopians. It is, in other expression, it is impossible for Egyptian not to be an Ethiopian. So if these are false premises, this is also a false conclusion. So it's valid. There is a flow of strict necessity, but here is not. It does not work here. All birds are mammals, all ants are mammals. First, then the ant must be a bird in order to argue in a valid way. So this also does not let us to strictly argue that all ants are birds. That's why we say that the validity, the truthful and the falsity and the truthfulness of the premise and the conclusion is not the important thing that helps in determining its validity. Rather, the connection between the premises and the conclusion, how it's flow. Now we can proceed to the concept of deduction and soundness. As I have told you, we cannot use the terms soundness in the case of inductive. But in your module, the term soundness and the strengths of the argument used interchangeably. For while you are reading your module, you can understand the word soundness and strengths as if they are similar. You can understand as similar, or not to be confused. But soundness is used for deductive argument, whereas strengths, that's weakness and strengths used in inductive arguments. So evaluation of every arguments relies on the evaluation of the two claims, as I have put, that's the inferential and the factual claim. We have also said that we will always test the inferential claim. The most, please, Yorisale, make it your mood. The most important thing is that the inferential claim, then the factual claim, because the inferential we have taken that is the reasoning process, whereas the factual claim is, it is fact, the value or the genuinity of the claim itself on the ground. So it is not the genuinity or the fact or the factuality of the evidence that on the ground is most important than the inferential claim. So inferential claim, unlike the factual claim, is the most important thing in determining or in understanding the relationship between the premise and the conclusion. So depending on their actual ability, which means assuming that they already have actual accompanies the inferential claim by being valid and to accomplish their factual claim as deductive argument can be either sound or unsound. Okay, it can be both sound and unsound. We have said deductive argument can be valid, at the same time it can be also invalid. The same, the key point in deductive, an argument can be sound, at the same time it can be unsound. When we say an argument is a sound argument, when it is valid, first it must be valid. That deductive argument must be valid. If it is invalid, we cannot speak about the soundness of an argument in deductive argument. First, it must be valid. Means from the above possibilities, what works for the soundness of the argument is the valid cases. At the same time, the premises must also be true. If these two conditions exist simultaneously, we can say that the other deductive argument is sound. But if this does not exist, or if it is not the case, that is not sound, rather that is unsound. Therefore, unsound argument in deductive is either valid or one or more false premises are invalid or both workers. So sound argument here you can look at here. Let me note it first. As you can look here, a sound argument is equivalent with a valid argument plus not only having valid argument plus it requires, besides having a valid argument, we need a true premises. If we have this, if these two exist simultaneously or analogously, we can take that that's a sound argument. Now let's look at evaluating of inductive arguments. We have seen evaluation of deductive argument by taking those possibilities, the four possibilities. The same point, the same case in point here, we'll look at its strings. In the case of deductive, we have seen it is soundness. Don't forget, we have seen the case of deductive, we have seen is soundness. In this case of inductive, we see its strings and its cogency. We have seen its validity and it is the soundness in the case of deductive argument, whereas we see strings and cogency in the case of inductive argument. The same rule applies for evaluation of inductive argument. The difference is that the flow of the reasoning from the premise to the conclusion. Because we have said that in the case of inductive argument, the reasoning process is that if we have a true premises, it is not possibly, it's probably the conclusion to be false. So the reasoning process from the premises to the conclusion is not in a strict necessity, rather it's on probability from the very outset. That is the only difference in evaluating inductive argument and deductive argument. The remaining issues are similar, only separating this point. As you can look at from your screen, it says an inductive argument as one in which the premises are going to support the conclusion in such a way that if they are assumed true, don't forget, assumed true. Don't worry about here the actual or the fact or the genuinity of the premise of the ground. Assume that they are true. It's improbable, not impossible for the conclusion to be false. Then it's said to be strong. So when we say that an inductive argument is strong when we have a true premises and if it is improbable for the conclusion to be false. In this case, our argument is sound. If this is not the key point, if this is not does not work, it is a weak inductive argument. Therefore, a strong inductive argument is an argument such a way that if the premises are assumed true, it's improbable for the conclusion to be false. In such argument, the conclusion flows probably from the premises. You see here, probably from the premise. Conversely, when we say a weak inductive argument, if the premises are assumed true, similar assumption, and if it's probable for the conclusion to be false. In the case of strong inductive argument, it is improbable for the conclusion to be false when we have or if we assume that the premises are true. But in the case of weak induction, the difference lies here. We may assume that the premises are true, but the conclusion can probably be false. This is the distinction where it lies between the weak and the strong. Don't forget this one. For example, look this one. This barrel contains 100 apples. That is premises 1, and 8 apples selected at random were found tasty from a container that is which contains apples. We select 8 apples randomly, and they found they're tasty. By taking these two premises, an arguer infers that probably all 100 apples are tasty. Look here, how the reasoning process flows from these two premises to the conclusion. These are examples of strong arguments because we have taken 8 apples randomly from hundreds of apples. So if they are tasty, probably the remaining 92 apples may be tasty. So here the conclusion that is probably for the 100 apples are tasty, actually probably from the premises. You can understand when you look at the second examples, when you look at the difference in the samples, the numbers of apples that we select randomly. Look at the second example in order to understand the first. It says, the same example, this pair contains 100 apples, but here we select 3 randomly. You see the difference of the probability of selecting 3 apples from hundreds of apples and selecting 8 apples from hundreds of apples. Which one is probably true? I think you guess selecting 8 apples is probably more important in order to conclude that probably that the other 92 apples are tasty. See the difference? The number here. So the number here matters. So this is weak argument. Because you see this one, 3 apples, and the first one is 8 apples. When you compare this, the first examples works for strong arguments because it does not actually probably from the premise and to the conclusion. Of course, it tries to claim it to be as true, but when we look at this probability, it is less than the first one. So the procedure that helps for testing the strengthness of the inductive argument is you can refer the rules that we have applied in the case of deductive argument. The same procedure that is looking at the relation of the connection between the premise and the conclusion. The difference is that the probability and the possibility of the relationship between the premise and the conclusion. Now let's look at strengths and truth value. The same in case point that we have looked in the case of deductive. From the above examples, you can understand 2 most important things about the strengths of inductive arguments. Strengths, that is the weakness of the argument and the strongness of the argument. The first thing that you can learn from the above example is that Unlike the validity and the invalidity of the deductive arguments, the strength and the weakness of inductive arguments admit certain forms of degrees. You see? The degree varies between the deductive and the inductive. That is the strengthness of the inductive argument and the weakness of the argument. The degree, for example, when we look at selecting of 8 apples and selecting of 3 apples, which one is better off in order to argue that the remaining apples on the containers are probably tasty? Selecting 8 than selecting the 3. So the degree matters. To be considered a strong and inductive argument must have conclusions that is more probable than improbable. So the chance of probability in the case of that is strong argument is that it's more probable than improbable. But in the case of weak, the chance of being probable is less, which means it's more improbable than the probable. Inductive argument. In inductive argument, there is no absolute strong nor absolute weak argument. What we can surely speak of is that in the case of inductive, whether it is strong or weak argument, the reasoning process from the premises to the conclusion does not help us to conclude that absolutely. We cannot say absolutely or certainly or necessarily. We may say probably or improbably, likely or unlikely. Likely it may be works, at the same time it may not also, it may also not be works. For instance, if it is not absolutely weak nor the second absolutely strong, both arguments will be strengthened or weakened by the random selection of the larger or the smaller sample. We have seen these skills. The second lesson that we can learn from the above 2 examples is that the validity and the invalidity, that is, strength and weakness, are only directly related to the truth value of their premises. It's not direct, okay? The central question in determining its strength and its weakness is whether the conclusion will probably be true if the premises are assumed true. So here, the same rule applies in the case of inductive as of the deductive. It is our assumption that determines the strength and the weakness. That is based on probability. For an argument to be strong, it's not necessarily that the premises or the conclusion be true, but merely that if the premise assumed true, it is improbable for the conclusion to be false. It's very clear, I think. This is, we do not have whether the premise of an argument actual true in order to determine strength. As I have told you, don't worry about the actual or the factual or the genuinity of the premises, even in the case of inductive. The most important thing here is also the inferential, the reasoning process. Testing of an argument in the case of strings, what we need to do is assume the premise, assuming here, there's the term, assume the premise true, and then to see whether the conclusion follow more or less, the degree. You see the degree. If it is more, or if it is, the chance is more probable than not to be, it is certainly strong. If it is less probable, that is weak. If it is less probable, the degree of occurrence, that's the chance. If it is less, it is weak. If the relation between the premise and the conclusion follows in such a way that if the premise true and the conclusion is probably more of to be true, that's strong, or it's strength. Therefore, strength or weakness in an inductive argument results not from actual truth or false of the premises of the conclusion, but the probabilistic support of the premises to the conclusion. The same rule as of that in the case of deductive. Look, the probabilities. We have seen probabilities in the case of, don't forget, deductive. Here, the examples are in the case of inductive. The same thing, the difference is that it is the strings. In the case of inductive, it may be strong, it may be weak, but in the case of deductive, it may be valid, it may be also invalid. The remaining thing is the same, except, look here, the second example, here when we have true premises and false conclusion, is always weak. Means the degree of to be is very less. So this typically an examples of weak inductive argument. But the remaining three possibilities can be either weak or strong, depending on the relationship between the premise and the conclusion. If there is a relationship between the premise and the conclusion in such a way that there is true premises, and it is more likely to be the conclusion to be true, it is a strong inductive argument. The opposite is also true. You can read examples of this from your module. The last point in the induction is induction and cogency. In the case of deductive, we have seen it is soundness and deduction. In the case of induction, it is cogency and it's induction. Depending on their actual ability, don't forget. Still, we are applying the same principle for all cases, except that the second possibilities for both deductive and inductive arguments. Very simple to understand if you are wise. Depending on their actual ability, that assuming that they already have actually accomplished their inferential claim by being strong to accomplish their factual claim, the inductive argument can be both cogent or uncogent. A cogent argument is an inductive argument that's strong and or has true premises. I think you remember in the case of deductive, we have to take that a strong argument is an argument when you have all true premises, and valid premises, or valid arguments and true premises. The same rule in the case of cogent argument. You can understand cogent argument as, in the case of deductive, as sound argument. The difference is the probability and the certainty of the premises and the conclusion. Both conditions must be met. The same rule. It must be strong, at the same time it must be all true premises to be a cogent. If these two conditions are not fulfilled, analogously, it is uncogent. If it meets one criteria of these two, we label that as uncogent inductive argument. An inductive argument that does not actually accomplish it is inferential claim that is not strong cannot be cogent, regardless of the truth value of its premises. It's very clear. Such an inductive argument is uncogent by definition, which means that uncogent argument is an inductive argument that either is strong with one or more false premises, or weak, or both. Because the conclusion of a cogent argument is genuinely supported by true premises. It follows that the conclusion of every cogent argument is probably true. So a cogent argument is an inductive analogy of sound deductive argument. I have told you this one. So you can use this formula to understand what a cogent argument is, both strong argument plus all true premises. If this fulfilled, it's a cogent inductive argument. But there is difference between sound and uncogent argument in regard to truth premises requirements. In sound arguments, it's only necessary that the premises are true and nothing more. Given this, that the premise and the good reasoning are true, conclusion is granted. Whereas in the case of cogent argument, the premise must not only be true, not only to be true. What's the case in the sound argument, the case of deductive? They must also not ignore some important piece of evidence that outweigh the given evidence and entail the quite different conclusion. That is, if the premises reflect all the important, all the necessary, I mean important, it's possible to take the necessary, important, because the terminology matters, factors, then the argument is cogent. If not, obviously that is not uncogent. Therefore, for cogency, the premise must not only be true, but also overlook some important factors that outweighs the given evidence and requires a different conclusion. I think this is the end of the slides. Today,
ልዩነት መፍጠር ዓላማችን ነው። ዓለም አቀፍ ተወዳዳሪ መሆን አለባችሁ። የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ ጥራትና ደረጃውን የጠበቀ ስልጠና በመስጠት ብቁ ዜጋ እያፈራን ነው። በፍላይት ኦፕሬሽን፣ በበረራ መስተንግዶ፣ በቲኬቲንግና ሪዘርቬሽን፣ በሆቴልና ቱሪዝም ሙያዎች አሰልጥነን ተወዳዳሪ እናደርጎታለን። ኮሌጃችን ካናዳ ከሚገኘው ኢንተርናሽናል ኤር ትራንስፖርት አሶሲዬሽን አያታና ከእንግሊዙ ICM ጋር በመተባበር ዓለም አቀፍ ዕውቅና ያለው ስልጠና እየሰጠ ይገኛል። በፍላይት ኦፕሬሽን፣ በበረራ መስተንግዶ የምንሰጣቸው ስልጠና ከኢትዮጵያ ሲቪል አቪዬሽን ባለስልጣን ሙሉ ዕውቅና አለው። አድራሻ ከጎላጉል ታወር 22 አደባባይ ወደ ሾላ በሚወስደው መንገድ ላይ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ ህልሞን እውን ያደርጋል።